Welcome to today's webinar and thank you for joining us. As you can probably tell, I'm not Simon Fowler, our CEO, who is due to host today's session. Unfortunately, he's had some unforeseen circumstances, so he's had to drop out today, so I'm stepping in. I'm Ginny Hallam. I'm Director of the Empowering People Group's Legal Division, and I'm really excited to be able to host today's session in our series of People Priorities in 2025. So before we get started, here's a quick overview of who we are and why we're here today. The Empowering People Group is a group of HR, employment law and coaching specialists. We deliver innovative, tech-led products and services designed to simplify employee experiences and empower people to drive business success. And today we're covering the second topic in a series designed to help simplify the complexities that the year ahead is set to bring. At the end of the series, we aim to give you practical, actionable insights to tackle these priorities and thrive in 2025. That does rhyme. And today's session is focused on empowering HR to be business-driven, strategic partners that are best placed to help organisations navigate the legal and financial challenges that we're all facing this year. So before we dive into that, there is just a bit of housekeeping to go through to help you get the best out of the session. The screen you see in front of you is fully customizable, so you can drag and move the speaker and the slide views to position them however you prefer. You'll find speaker bios listed in the panel next to these, and you can read more about us and today's panel speakers at any point. We've attached some resources on the topics being discussed, which you can download during the session, but we'll also send them out after the webinar along with a recording. And lastly, there's a contact us box below, so you can get in touch with us at any time during the session. If you want to ask a question, simply pop it in the Q&A comment box at the bottom, and we'll do our very best to answer all of them by the end of the session. If we don't get to them though, then we'll follow up with answers after the webinar. So let me introduce you to today's panel. I'm delighted to welcome Martin Cornforth. He's Director of Litigation and at our Employment Law Division. And Martin is bringing with him an extensive legal expertise and pragmatic commercial view to solving issues organisations face in today's evolving employment law landscape. Hi, Martin.
Hi, Ginny. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, great to have you on board. I'm also very happy to introduce to you Sam Wengeroth, Senior Coach from our Coaching and Outplacement Division. Sam brings a wealth of experience in coaching and people development and is passionate about enabling organisations to support workforces to achieve their full potential. So hi, Sam.
Hello, really happy to be here today.
No, thank you for joining us. Right, so shall we delve into today's topic? We know that UK organisations are facing unprecedented challenges from complexities of new employment law and ever-shifting economic reality. So the financial impacts of increased minimum wage, national insurance contributions, the pressures are immense. To navigate these complex challenges that impact human capital, HR must become true strategic drivers, creating agile, resilient workforces that can help organisations to flourish. But unfortunately, organisations will inevitably face challenging decisions in the coming year, and HR leaders are going to have to play a crucial role in shaping these. While many HR teams are recognised for their strategic contributions, there is still work to be done. I think we'd all agree to secure HR's presence at the boardroom table. So we need to accelerate that evolution of HR from traditional roles to strategic, to drive organisational success and deliver the future of work. So today we're going to dive into the barriers that may be hindering HR's ability to be business-driven strategic partners. We're going to look at hot topics of manager empowerment, data-driven strategies, and the cost savings and efficiencies that many organisations are yet still to harness. So let's get into it. So Martin, should we come to you first? So we've discussed over the last 12 months lots of changing pieces of legislation relating to sexual harassment, collective consultation and the upcoming Employment Rights Bill. So alongside these legal shifts, organisations also face significant budgetary pressures with upcoming increases to national minimum wage, national insurance contributions this April. How are companies going to respond to this with these increased responsibilities and the financial burden? And what impacts is this going to have on managers and HR teams? What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Ginny. It's a really important question, and it's one that's coming up quite frequently at the moment for the reasons that you've given. And we're seeing companies respond in a variety of ways. So some are being quite proactive, identifying and reviewing what needs to change. Other companies are being a bit more reactive, and unfortunately, some aren't yet responding at all. And this is creating a significant layer of complexity for managers and HR. And so there's quite a lot to unpack. So firstly, what are those companies doing that are being more proactive? So they're sort of reviewing and updating policies on things like sexual harassment, bullying, discrimination. And often the focus of that review is on preventative measures, such as enhanced training for managers and employees. And the aim there is to sort of nip issues in the bud and prevent them from escalating and arising, and also preparing and getting ahead for the new day one rights. So obviously next year there will be a day one right to claim unfair dismissal, and proactive employers are overhauling probation periods now to ensure that they're ready for that. And one thing we're seeing is a request in an increase in request for bespoke training programs on topics such as driving performance. You'd expect performance to be a key part of reviewing probation periods, and so you can see why that makes sense. In addition, policy audits are taking place and independent reviews of internal grievance procedures. And those are all positive steps to take, but it requires a significant investment of time and resources from both HR and management. And that creates a tension when in the current climate, resources are quite tight and cost cutting is being prioritized in many businesses. And so what does a more reactive response look like? So some companies are adopting a sort of wait and see approach where they sort of wait and see if a legal issue arises, and then they respond to that as it happens. And the reason why that's very risky is because that can increase costs and time further down the line. It can make it more complex than it needed to have been. So often an issue can be dealt with at an early stage before it escalates and becomes more complex. And the risk of just reacting is that it's actually been more costly. So the aim might have been to save costs, but it's actually had the opposite effect. And that puts pressure on HR and managers who are dealing with sensitive and complex situations. And if the organization hasn't been proactive, then they've often lacked the training to then deal with those more complex situations. And that's often when our intervention is then needed, where perhaps it could have been avoided. One of the potential risk here is when you're going through these sorts of changes is adopting a tick box mentality. And the temptation here is to make sure you're following legal compliance by reviewing things like policies, but not then embedding them in the culture. So there's a sort of gap between what the policies are saying and the actual experience on the ground of employees. And that can, again, be difficult for HR and managers to deal with that and sort of reconcile the gap between them. And with that sort of tick box mentality, it's when an incident arises that it becomes painfully apparent that there's a gap between procedure and what actually happens in practice. Just to come back to the point about the pressure for cost reductions. It's also creating a perfect storm for HR personnel as they need to react to the new changes at a time when resources are much more limited. And that can impact on hiring plans, and it requires consideration of pay structures, potentially reduction in headcount. And for HR, there's not just the administrative burden of that. It's also dealing with the emotional impact on employees at the same time. It's difficult, morale can be reduced during these sorts of periods, and HR still need to remain competitive in attracting and retaining talent. And many HR personnel and managers are feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of new information and requirements. And one question that arises in this scenario is whether managers have the skills to deal with these changes. One thing that is probably going to be needed for HR to focus more on strategy is for managers to be upskilled and empowered to deal with people issues. Both HR and managers are often expected to be legal experts, cultural ambassadors, employee advocates, financial strategists, and on top of all that, just managing their day-to-day responsibilities. And many HR professionals are feeling overwhelmed and under-resourced, leading to burnout and high turnover. Managers too are struggling to keep up with the ever-changing legal and economic landscape often, and they often lack the training and support to handle those issues. In fact, a recent Gartner stat showed that 75% of HR leaders believe that managers are overwhelmed by their responsibilities. But if companies are going to navigate the complexities ahead, then as I've said, I think managers will need to be upskilled and become more effective people leaders. And this may mean that in this period of change that HR personnel have to take more risks and put their head above the parapet. But ultimately, leadership will need to commit to ensuring that there's adequate resources for HR and ongoing training for managers.
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, it's clear that somebody's going to have to give to enable organisations to deliver sustainable futures, isn't it? Sam, I mean, it couldn't be clearer from that overview that Martin's just given that managers are a vital component in this. But the Gartner statistic is pretty startling, isn't it? I mean, how do we address the capability gap when cost cutting is likely to mean a tighter workforce? What do you think?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Gartner stat is a bit of a wake-up call. We can't achieve a sustainable future of work if our managers are overwhelmed. It's rightfully that. Organisations are facing so many cost pressures and potentially leaner teams. So something has to give, as you say. And I firmly believe that something is a shift towards empowering managers, creating compassionate, competent people leaders. That's now a business imperative, I think, as we face the uncertain economic future ahead. Now, cost cutting doesn't have to mean capability cutting. In fact, investing in manager development is a bit of a strategic move that will pay dividends in the long run. So I've got some practical pointers on how to address this manager capability gap, but even with tighter resources. So firstly, we need to focus on the fundamentals of compassionate leadership and move beyond, the traditional view as managers being just taskmasters. The future of work demands leaders who can connect with their teams on more of an emotional, more human level, understanding their individual needs and motivations. We need people leaders who can help create psychologically safe environments, where people feel supported and valued. So now this isn't about being soft, though. It's about being strategic, because employees with an emotional commitment to the organisation are more likely to be more productive and more engaged. Now, we feel compassionate leadership drives this engagement, so that can ultimately lead to greater efficiency and lower talent turnover, which is absolutely critical to success in this current climate. Secondly, we would say trust your managers to make decisions, provide them with the resources and support they need to manage their teams effectively. We do talk a lot about the accidental manager, so somebody who's promoted for their technical skills, not their people management skills. These managers are actually commonplace in workplaces today, and especially in hybrid and remote environments, being an effective people manager is harder than ever. So HR teams need to prioritise what's required to quickly upskill their people leaders. So to do this well, investment in targeted development programs that address the specific challenges that managers face in the current business context are the answer. Focus on those skills like effective communication, active listening, conflict resolution, and providing constructive feedback. Crucially, incorporate training on how to lead with compassion and empathy. That can still be done cost effectively through online resources, peer coaching, and really good mentoring programs. As we look to a future of greater day one rights, preparing managers for their role and effectively assessing new recruits, but also addressing poor performance or behaviours, that'll be a huge shift for many organisations and managers. So getting ahead now really is essential. Next, creating a culture of feedback and continuous learning is really essential for growth. So encourage your managers to solicit feedback from their teams, provide them with regular coaching and support. Create a culture where learning is valued and managers feel safe to admit their mistakes and seek additional support. So the fourth point is to recognise and reward this effective leadership. Now, many organisations reward performance based on metrics and targets, and it's very data-based. And those are incredibly performance to use those metrics. But it's also just as important to recognise and reward managers who demonstrate that effective leadership. That will also send a clear message out that those qualities are valued and essential for business success. And finally, although this is not an exhaustive list, organisations need to leverage technology to effectively empower those managers. So the right technology is a powerful tool because it can streamline repetitive tasks, provide access to learning resources, and facilitate compliant and consistent processes that will improve employee experiences. But HR and technology leaders need to collaborate to assess where does the technology add the most benefit. There are so many digital solutions that promise the earth. It's very difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff. The most important consideration is how the technology can improve the work, effectively reduce the costs, but more importantly, don't lose that essential work that only us humans can do. So investment in technology that empowers managers should be based on how it simplifies work, not just digitalises it. If you engage experts in this field, that's really essential to avoid being caught up in the latest hype. Addressing the capability gap is not about adding more work for already stretched managers. It's about working smarter by investing in compassionate leadership, empowering your managers with technology and training, and creating that culture of feedback and learning. Organisations can build a more resilient, engaged and productive workforce, even with limited resources.
Yeah, it's so good to hear you talk through all of that. I mean, especially the tech point, Sam. We're really passionate as the Empowering People Group in our technology, and we're consistently seeing how the right technology investments can and does give organisations the biggest opportunity to reduce costs and improve productivity, open up massive new avenues for cost reductions. As you said, Sam, empowering line managers to handle more people matters is a vital strategy for modern HR function. It obviously enables greater efficiency, responsiveness, but empowerment can introduce risk, can't it? Especially with the growing prevalence of AI tools that offer HR advice. AI offers potential benefits, clearly, faster access to information, streamlined processes, but also massive concerns. There's algorithmic bias, lack of contextual understanding, potential data privacy breaches, to name a few, really. So managers might inadvertently then misinterpret or misapply AI-generated advice, and then that leads to inconsistencies, inconsistent application of policies, perhaps legal missteps, legal mishaps. So that's going to need mitigation of risks, and we're going to need to look at a number of different things in order to do that. This includes establishing clear policies and guidelines that managers can follow, providing comprehensive training on employment law, as Martin's talks about, and ethical AI use, along with ensuring human oversight remains a critical component of the decision making. Empowering People Group, so we've got a unique technology called Empower, which is developed by our employee relations experts to enable all of this. The technology transforms how organisations manage employee relations processes by actually empowering the managers to self-serve people matters in the moment, which is critical. It uses guided journeys to step managers through compliant and consistent processes with embedded training, policies and process guides, all as part of it. And that means that managers don't need to engage HR in as many ER matters, which would otherwise normally be escalated up to the HR team. I think typically we see more than 60% of employee relations tasks being entirely self-managed by line managers that use Empower. And this manager empowerment significantly reduces the day-to-day burden then on HR teams, freeing them up to then focus on the strategic priorities. And perhaps most critically, Empower includes built-in lock points based on each organisation's policies and procedures, which then ensures that you keep controls an HR team and HR are engaged where necessary. Maybe there's been a protected characteristic that's at play, and HR are then involved at a point when perhaps there's an escalation that's required. I guess ultimately the goal is to try and create an environment where managers are empowered to make informed decisions and be better people leaders, whilst simultaneously ensuring that the organisation's values and legal obligations are upheld. In addition to empowering managers, Empower also has dashboards and analytics that provide visibility of so much data, which can surface the root cause of issues that might be impacting productivity and performance, or may be negatively impacting employee engagement. There might be pockets of poor culture in areas where managers need more training maybe. But obviously without the data visibility, you're not going to get those insights, and it then just becomes big data and issues become overlooked. So by leveraging technology like Empower, that should significantly improve cost efficiencies. It will reduce risk of costly employment tribunal claims. High sickness absence and employee underperformance will also be reduced. And the time to invest is now, because research is showing that over 60% of UK HR teams lack data visibility and are consumed by day-to-day people management tasks. And as we head towards the new day one employment rights that Martin's talked about as part of the Employment Rights Bill, we are undoubtedly going to see an increase in the volume of employment tribunal claims, putting even more pressure on managers and HR. So it's crucial for businesses to review their employee relations processes and invest now in fit-for-purpose tools so that they're ready and the new ways of working are embedding before the new laws come into force. What do you think, Martin? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, thanks, Ginny. The technology investment can deliver significant returns. And as you touched on, improving compliance is key too, particularly with the Employment Rights Bill coming in. So it's pretty clear that significant policy updates will be required and new processes when the new laws come into force. And so getting managers upskilled and empowered now to deal with more people matters would significantly reduce the risk of non-compliance in the process of managing employee relations matters. Our training session on managing difficult conversations can help here, as it aims to give managers the skills to discuss issues like performance, absence, and conduct before they get to a formal stage. So one of the difficulties managers can face in discussing those sort of issues is that someone can become defensive, react emotionally, and if managers are sort of able to have those conversations and address issues like that without them escalating, this is something that we aim to address. And as you've mentioned, Ginny, this can help reduce employment tribunal claims for several reasons. One is simply nipping issues in the bud before they escalate, and often actually de-escalating issues and having better manager and employee interactions. It can also help evidence that processes are followed in a compliant and consistent way. Often tribunals will be expecting employers to try to informally resolve issues before they escalate anyway, and so it helps to show that compliance. It also frees up HR, as we've both mentioned, to focus on strategy, and that means being able to identify issues that are impacting on performance and culture that need to be addressed. We've already touched on the day one right for unfair dismissal, but it can't really be emphasized enough. It's going to be a really significant change, I think. It's difficult to see how it won't be a really significant change. And that means that, businesses, organizations are going to need to look at their probation periods very carefully, and that's going to impact on all aspects of line management with onboarding. And so empowering managers to deal with those issues now is absolutely essential.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't reiterate this point enough, can we? Now is the time to act, to understand the business changing benefits employees' relations transformation delivers. So I hope we've articulated it sufficiently as to how vital manager empowerment is in freeing up HR to be able to focus on strategic priorities and deliver the future of work. So I guess now it would be great to delve back into what else needs to be done in order to overcome other barriers that hinder HR from being more business driven. What do we really mean when we say business driven HR? I know I'm speaking to an experienced HR audience here, but it is worth reiterating the foundational work of Dave Ulrich, the father of modern HR, who really shaped our thinking, didn't he, about strategic HR, and he championed the idea of HR moving beyond simply administering processes and becoming a true strategic partner. A business-driven HR function is deeply integrated with the overall strategic goals and objectives of the organisation. It's about understanding the business inside and out, the industry, the competitive landscape, the financial targets, and then translating those goals into concrete HR initiatives. It's about HR being proactive, not reactive, anticipating challenges and opportunities rather than simply just responding to them, being ahead of them. However, despite the widespread recognition of human capital's value, there is still a perception gap that needs addressing. We often still hear that HR do not have a seat at the table or are just seen as a cost centre rather than a driver of value. And perception isn't something HR can tackle alone. It requires collaborative efforts between HR and business leaders. Organisational leaders need to actively involve HR in strategic decisions. They need to bring them to the table. They need to recognise their expertise in talent management, in organisational design, and obviously employee engagement. And then in turn, HR professionals then need to demonstrate their business acumen and use the data that we've talked about and analytics to prove the return on investment of HR initiatives and communicate their value consistently in terms that resonate with business leaders. So it's about building a shared understanding of how people strategy directly impacts business outcomes and then working together to create a people strategy that fuels growth and drives sustainable success. And this collaborative approach is essential to truly unlock the potential of business-driven HR functions. So, Sam, we've talked about the importance of manager empowerment. We've talked about technology enablement to free up HR to focus on strategy. But how do you think we address this perception gap?
You're spot on there, Ginny. Empowering managers and leveraging technology and data are really, really crucial. But they don't fully address the perception gap if we don't start tackling it head on now. And it's not just about HR doing strategic work. It's, as you say, about them being perceived as strategic. So how do we shift that perception? So you've actually already touched on the most important of these. But before I delve into some specific pointers, I just want to dig a bit further onto the barriers we face. We're trying to move the dial and change perceptions. So firstly, we know that HR and people teams are considered strategic partners in their organisation, but there is widespread evidence of a need to reframe the narrative around HR. So it's not a criticism of the current work of HR, but it's about the external perception. So actually, one of the most recent examples of this is the press coverage on how Keir Starmer was called a HR manager, implying a slight on his strategic leadership skills. Now, we feel this kind of rhetoric needs to be changed. HR leaders need to actively challenge these perceptions to ensure that HR is more widely recognised as the strategic function they are. Secondly, beyond the external pressures, we will face a bit of an internal hurdle. HR professionals potentially are understandably hesitant to relinquish the day-to-day operational focus that they're used to. So they might even be uncertain about taking on broader strategic responsibilities. So to address that, we need to communicate the why behind the change. It's not just about what the organisation needs, it's about what HR professionals stand to gain. So greater influence, more meaningful work, and enhanced career opportunities for them as individuals. So providing training and development to equip HR professionals with the strategic skills they need is vital. And we need to create cultures that reward this strategic thinking and empower HR to take on a more proactive role. Critically, we must demonstrate how empowering line managers will ultimately free HR from tactical firefighting, allowing them to focus on more strategic, impactful work.
That's such an important point, Sam. We talk a lot about freeing up HR, don't we? I like your phrase, tactical firefighting. And we're trying to free up HR to be more strategic, aren't we? But we need to ensure that we take our HR professionals on the journey with us. Otherwise, we'll disengage our best talent, which obviously we don't want to do. We also often get pushback from HR teams that their managers aren't ready to take on the management of More People Matters. And that Gartner stat Martin mentioned earlier highlights this as a common concern. I think changing mindsets is a vital part of the conversation. Like any change programme, the hearts and minds piece needs to be prioritised, doesn't it? So we're talking about two perception shifts, I think, needed here. The first being the external perception of HR, and the second being the internal shift in how HR professionals perceive where they're adding most value. Is that about right? Does that sound right?
No, I absolutely, definitely agree. You can't have one without the other. I've actually got some tips I believe will help shift the perception and successfully position HR as business-driven strategic partners. So number one, as we spoke about before, data, and more data. We can't stress this enough. With the right tools, HR can provide the data-driven insights, which then inform strategic decision-making. So we need to make sure HR teams are fluent in data analytics and they can communicate the insights business-wide. Gut feelings and anecdotal evidence still kind of lead key decisions, but that can lead to errors. So organisations and HR teams are awash with data. So we don't just mean go and collect more, but identify the actual data that can then inform the decision making. Having the tools and analytical support to provide these insights that tell a compelling story and use the data properly. Next, HR professionals need to be fluent in the language of business. So ensuring HR are trained in understanding financial statements, key performance indicators, and market trends will help them to be able to articulate HR's contribution in terms of business outcomes. For example, they can talk about how employee engagement impacts customer satisfaction and then ultimately the bottom line. So that potentially means developing more business acumen within the HR team if it's lacking. Another fundamental area is to address, would be building relationships. HR professionals need to build strong relationships with business leaders across the organisation. So becoming a trusted advisor, someone they turn to for insights and solutions on people-related issues, that really requires proactive communication and a genuine understanding of the business challenges. Secondly, they need to build trust in their line manager cohort, working with them to identify learning and capability gaps that will then help them become compassionate and confident people leaders. So we're not just talking about cutting the apron strings, and leaving managers to flounder. We need to ensure we've got all the support in place to enable managers to self-serve the people matters consistently and compliantly, but with the right safeguards in place. Next, I would highlight internal communications as being key. Don't be afraid to celebrate HR wins. So if a HR initiative has a positive impact on the business, make sure everybody knows about it. Share the success stories, case studies, testimonials. That really helps demonstrate the value of HR and builds credibility. Highlight the positive impact that your HR is having. And then finally, we all need to take responsibility for actively changing the rhetoric. So that may take time, but combining a data-driven approach with good communication that demonstrates HR's role in driving business success is really, really imperative. Addressing the perception gap is an ongoing process that requires consistent effort, a focus on data and analytics, and a commitment to building strong relationships.
That's really interesting. I mean, some great points there. I mean, I think the Keir Starmer example, Sam, has actually helped us to start challenging these perceptions, hasn't it? So it's been useful in that way. We did actually produce an interesting press article on the topic, which we've shared below in case anyone wants to read a bit more. Martin, are there any other ways you'd suggest we can accelerate this evolution of the perception of HR?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this perception issue is something we see come up in legal cases too often, really, which highlights the need for change. One example of that is where HR personnel felt the need to intervene in a disciplinary decision or process, which can be unhelpful, and it raises the question of why the manager wasn't already equipped to deal with the disciplinary process and reach consistent decisions and the like. So yeah, I mean, Sam's points are spot on, and I'd add from a legal perspective that HR needs to be seen as a strategic partner in mitigating risk and not just reacting to problems, as we've emphasised. And that means proactive risk management through robust policies, training and consistent procedures. And as Sam highlighted, data can help identify those issues, including potential legal issues, to help sort of drive compliance through the data. And that can then highlight why those measures might be needed to save time, money, and reputation. And if those changes have been identified, changes that need to be made, then I would emphasize that collaboration with legal counsel is important from the outset, not just reacting when a problem arises, but sort of taking advice from legal counsel to sort of save time later on if a lawyer comes in and says, actually, we need to change all of that. Training managers on employment law and best practice is also vital, empowering them and freeing them up for HR. And it sounds a bit cliche from a lawyer, but thorough documentation of everything is non-negotiable for defending against challenges and potential proceedings. And essentially, HR needs to be seen as proactively managing risk and ensuring that compliance and resolving disputes, demonstrating their value as a strategic partner. I also think that we need to be clear on the distinction between roles responsibilities with people matters. So we've seen cases, for example, where health and safety matters have been missed and not managed properly because of a crossover of responsibilities. So it's been unclear whether a health and safety issue belongs with HR or with a different department or with line managers. And as a result, that issue's just fallen through the cracks, and no one's really taken ownership of it. And that can obviously be very risky. And so having clarity in roles and responsibility and clear direction on what matters should be expedited. And this is also where the technology and the guided journeys you mentioned earlier, Ginny, can really help ensure that the right processes are followed at the right time, I think.
Yeah, that is a great point. And I think now is the time, isn't it, for HR teams to digitally transform many of the processes that can add risk to the business. So we are absolutely here to help as the Empowering People Group supports this urgent need for change in the ways of working that we've talked about today. Right, I'm conscious of time. You've both covered a lot there. Thank you so much. There are some really meaty priorities. And if we were to summarise them in a statement, I'd say that business-driven HR requires a revolution in manager empowerment, tech enablement, and strategic positioning. So that's everything we planned to cover today. Now let's take a look at some of the questions that have been coming in. So we have one question that says, so you've discussed the ideal scenario, but what's the biggest mistake you see HR leaders making when attempting to transform their function, and how can they avoid it? Big question. What do you think?
Do you want me to take this first, Martin?
Yeah. So do I want to take it first?
Oh, I said, oh, do you want me to?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, feel free to.
We've probably got the same points, to be fair. It's a really good question. I suppose what we've seen before is potentially running before they can walk with the changes that are being implemented. I suppose it's thinking about embedding that change within the culture and ensuring alignment with strategy as well. We spoke a lot before about investing in training staff, making sure stakeholder involvement is really key, and also kind of continuing to adapt and evolve as the changes goes on. Is there any more that you'd add to that, Martin?
Yeah, I think you're right there about the need to adapt and evolve. So I think one mistake is to think that a project's been completed and not review the impact that it's actually having. Has it worked as we expected it to? Is it meeting the goals that we set for it? So yeah, I think. And I think that means continually learning in order to evolve, really. So, continuing to learn from this process. Otherwise, there's a risk that, if you think it's been completed and you don't review it, that actually there's aspects of it that aren't helpful, that just then become part of the culture and the policy, when actually ongoing review would have led to you identifying where you could improve further on that, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, sounds good. And also, if you've got the data, if you've got the tech in place with the data that can then pull through some useful information in terms of that review, as you say, Martin, then you can use that to see whether things are actually working or perhaps need to evolve still. We talk a lot about marginal gains and making small changes sometimes to address issues can often be as important as some of the bigger changes. Good stuff. I've got two more questions. So popped up. How do you ensure line managers don't inadvertently add risk when you empower them to manage more people matters? Good question, especially with the reliance on AI tools that may lack human judgment and empathy. Who wants to take this one first? Sam, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah, and I suppose we do talk to companies a lot about AI and how it can help, and we've spoken about data and metrics. I think, obviously, as they should be, organisations are quick to get on the AI train to keep them kind of up to speed with what's going on, and it's definitely evolving. but you need to implement some robust policies and procedures first. So gap analysis of where it can be used. Does it again meet with the strategic plan? And I think when we spoke earlier about equipping our leaders to be more empathetic and more kind of people leaders, again, it ties in with the use of the AI tools as well as the kind of effective leadership as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Martin?
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. I think the AI can produce some really helpful information in how something's worded if a manager's communicating with an employee, but it doesn't give you those tools of empathy. And as I mentioned during the discussion, one of the training sessions we offered of managing difficult conversations, one of the aims of that is to help managers recognize when someone is starting to react defensively, and that's something that AI can't really teach you. That's something that's partly through experience and partly through gaining experience from others. So, we would put role play sessions into our training, for example, to help people get that sort of experience in a safer setting of practicing having those sorts of conversations. I think just to pick up on what Sam mentioned about policies as well, we're not seeing many companies adopt policies, whether that as part of their IT policy or as a separate policy. We're not seeing much material on AI. And I think part of the reason for that is that the companies haven't really decided yet on what their policy is. I think people recognize that it's a really helpful tool, but they also recognize that there are risks with it, and they're not quite sure yet where to draw the lines. But I think it's probably better to look at getting policies in place and then learning from it, as we've discussed. Potentially updating policies quite quickly with AI, and we don't know exactly how it's going to unfold in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also talked about the Empower. We have spoken about the Empower tech today as well, haven't we? Which has got built-in reminders for managers in terms of policies, in terms of how they apply those, and also some locks so that they can't, if there's a particularly tricky issue that comes up, something like a protected characteristic, for example, that needs to be escalated, then that particular risk is then managed by HR and the HR team rather than the manager themselves. So there's lots you can do tech-wise as well, isn't there, to manage those risks so that managers don't then have to solely rely on AI tools and perhaps create some issues, whether it's legally or consistency-wise. Okay, finally, so how can leaders effectively communicate the value of manager empowerment and strategic HR initiatives to employees at all levels of the organisation? So just repeat that. So how can leaders effectively communicate the value of manager empowerment and strategic HR initiatives to employees at all levels of the organisation? Wow. What do you think?
Martin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, let's have a think. So, as we mentioned during the discussion, I think that showing that the resources are in place sends a message that's something leaders value. So making sure that HR is well resourced and making sure that the training is being invested in, that sends a message that this is valued, that this is important. Just trying to think if there's anything else. I guess communication is really important. When messages are sent out or when policy updates are released, putting messages on that and stressing the importance of it and making sure it aligns with the company's values and business strategy. Would you add anything?
I would agree.
Sam, what do you think?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, completely agree, actually, with what you said, Martin. I think also, we potentially spoke before about this, is having champions within the organisation at different levels that can then cascade the message. And even working with, you might have some people in the organisation who've been previously adverse to change. They're obviously really good influences if they're able to turn that around into a positive and get messages cascaded kind of a bit more effectively. And then again, as it comes down to an earlier point about better people leaders, if you have a better people leader who's able to resonate and have much more open engagements with staff, the messages then potentially cascade better.
Yeah, and I guess modelling is quite important as well, isn't it? Modelling the behaviours that have been introduced. You know, we talked about embedding something in culture, and my view is that a leader's actions often have a big impact on culture because they people like to respect the leader and they imitate them, and you know, it sort of sets a tone for the culture, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for those questions and for the answers. There is obviously so much more we could cover, so I'm sure we will follow up and cover some more detail in the next webinar session next month. That does bring us to a close, though, for today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the second in a series of webinars over the coming months, each covering different priorities that HR teams and business leaders are facing. We'll share invitations to the next session very soon, but if you'd like to discuss any of the points that have been raised in today's session, please just drop us a note in the contact box below and we will promise to get right back to you. And as we've touched on, all of these changes will require updates and amendments to your policies, training and technology. The Empowering People group is all about simple solutions to people challenges. So we are expertly placed to help with ensuring you're implementing the right solutions and driving long-term success to support agile and engaged workforce. We'd be delighted to chat through the solutions we have to get you to where you want to be. But in the meantime, thank you again, Martin and Sam, for your insights in the discussion today. And thank you once again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you all on another Empowering People group webinar in the future.